In the bustling halls of New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, Rick Thompson, a seasoned security officer, shares an unspoken bond with Levi, a German shepherd whose sharp instincts have saved countless lives. But on this routine patrol, something feels different. When Levi becomes suddenly agitated over a seemingly ordinary suitcase, Rick knows that this is no regular security check. As Levi paws desperately at the case, a deep unease creeps over Rick. What is hidden inside this unassuming bag? The story of loyalty, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond is about to take a dramatic turn, one that will leave you questioning everything. Watch now to uncover the mystery. Rick Thompson, a seasoned security officer at New York's bustling John F. Kennedy International Airport, had seen it all. But nothing compared to the partnership he shared with his canine companion Levi, a German shepherd with an instinctive ability to detect threats that no human eye could catch. At 39, Rick was a man of few words, his posture straight and movements sharp, a result of his time in the military. Though his face bore the marks of age and experience, his eyes, however, held a deep sadness, one that spoke of loss, of moments that could never be recaptured. Levi was more than a partner to Rick. He was a lifeline. The bond between the two went beyond the commands Rick gave and the obedience Levi showed. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent connection forged through years of training and shared experiences. They were a team, and in the world of airport security, they were the best. It was another ordinary morning when Rick and Levi began their routine patrol of the airport's baggage claim area. JFK was as busy as ever, passengers flowing through the terminals like a river. Rick moved through the crowd with ease, his eyes scanning the area while Levi stayed close by his side, alert to any potential threat. The hustle and bustle of the airport faded into the background as they performed their duties, checking luggage, scanning for anything suspicious, and ensuring that everything was in order. But then something changed. Levi, who had always been calm and collected, suddenly stopped. His body stiffened and his ears perked up. Rick immediately noticed the change in his partner's behavior. There was something different about Levi's stance, something that set him on edge. The dog moved forward, sniffing the air, and Rick followed, trying to understand what was going on. Levi's attention was drawn to an unmarked black suitcase resting on the carousel. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough, just another piece of luggage among hundreds of others. But there was something off about it. Levi's tail, usually wagging with enthusiasm during their patrols, was now stiff, and his body was rigid with focus. Rick paused, watching Levi's behavior closely. The dog, now pawing at the suitcase, let out a low, unusual whine, a sound Rick had never heard from him before. It wasn't a playful whine, nor was it the sound of discomfort. It was urgent, frantic. "Levi, what is it, boy?" Rick muttered under his breath, crouching down beside the dog. Levi continued to paw at the suitcase, circling it in an agitated manner. Rick's instincts kicked in. Something was definitely not right. The dog's behavior was too unusual, too intense for a regular security check. Levi had never reacted like this before, even to the most dangerous of items. Rick felt a knot form in his stomach as he stood up and surveyed the area around them. People were still walking by, oblivious to the situation unfolding in front of them. Without hesitation, Rick radioed for backup. "We've got a situation at Carousel 4. K9 showing unusual behavior. Requesting immediate assistance." As he waited for the response, he knelt down beside Levi, carefully examining the suitcase. There was no tag, no markings, nothing that would identify its owner or contents. The suitcase seemed to have passed through multiple airports, but there was no obvious reason why it would be flagged. Rick's mind raced. Was it a test? A trap? Or was it something else altogether? Levi's incessant pawing and strange whine continued. Rick's unease grew. Something was wrong, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that whatever was inside that suitcase was something worth investigating. The tension in the air was palpable as Rick made his decision. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He would have to open it. Rick crouched down beside the unmarked black suitcase, his fingers brushing against its cold, smooth surface. Levi continued to whine, his paws scratching at the fabric as though trying to reach something inside. The dog's agitation was a clear sign that something wasn't right, but the bag itself gave no obvious clues. No tags, no identifying information, nothing that stood out. It was as if the suitcase had appeared out of nowhere. "Just hang on, boy," Rick murmured, trying to soothe Levi as he stood up and surveyed the area. The constant hum of the airport surrounded him. The dull chatter of travelers, the clatter of luggage rolling along the conveyor belts, but none of it mattered. All Rick could focus on was the suitcase. His gut told him there was more to this than just a forgotten bag. He reached for his radio again, his voice calm but urgent. "This is Officer Thompson. I need immediate backup at Carousel 4. We have an unclaimed suitcase, and I'm not seeing anything normal. Proceeding with caution." The response came quickly. "Roger that. Backup on the way." Rick didn't wait. His mind was already running through the possibilities. Levi had never reacted like this before. Sure, there were times when the dog showed interest in bags, but nothing like this. Rick had been through countless security sweeps, and Levi had always been calm, measured. But now, there was a sense of panic in the air, a heaviness that Rick couldn't shake. He turned and motioned for Levi to stay back. With a deep breath, Rick walked toward the X-ray scanner positioned nearby where the suitcase had already passed through. As the officer behind the screen gave him a nod, Rick stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he watched the monitor. No alarms, no suspicious objects. The X-ray was clear, just a dense mass of something that didn't seem out of place. But Rick wasn't convinced. He had learned long ago that just because the technology didn't detect something didn't mean it wasn't there. It was his job to ensure that nothing slipped through the cracks. Rick's instincts were on high alert. Something was telling him that this suitcase wasn't just a forgotten item. The fact that it hadn't been claimed in 3 days, despite numerous attempts to get the owner to come forward, only added to his suspicion. "All right, let's do this," Rick muttered to himself as he motioned to Levi to stay put. With steady hands, he unlatched the suitcase. His heart pounded, but his mind remained focused. The moment the latch clicked open, a sharp, musty smell hit his nose. It wasn't just the typical stale air of luggage. This was something different. It smelled wrong. Rick slowly opened the top of the suitcase, bracing himself for what might be inside. He took a cautious glance inside, the edge of the fabric unfolding. Levi's whine grew louder, his paws digging at the floor, his frustration mounting. Rick reached into the suitcase and pulled out a wad of tightly packed newspaper, drenched with moisture. He carefully moved the newspaper aside, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Hidden beneath the layers of old paper were several small cages, each one containing a different animal. The first one, a red fox, appeared to be unconscious, its tiny body barely moving. The second cage held a porcupine, its quills fluffed up in alarm, but it, too, seemed weak. The third cage contained something Rick could barely comprehend, a small, badly dehydrated tiger cub, its body curled up on the bottom, struggling to breathe. His heart stopped. A tiger cub? In the middle of a bustling airport? Rick couldn't wrap his mind around it. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the suitcase and stood up. He looked around, trying to make sense of what he had just uncovered. Before Rick could process the situation, he heard footsteps behind him. The backup had arrived. 2 other officers, a supervisor, and an airport security guard. Their faces were filled with confusion as they crowded around the scene. "What's going on, Thompson?" the supervisor asked, his voice cautious. "What have we got?" Rick didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the suitcase, his mind racing. This wasn't just a case of lost luggage. This was something much bigger, and it was happening under their noses. The tiger cub wasn't the only animal suffering in that suitcase. He could feel it deep in his bones. "This isn't a routine case," Rick said, his voice low and steady. "We've got an animal trafficking operation on our hands, and I think we've just uncovered the first piece." He took a deep breath, knowing that what they had just stumbled upon would change everything. The suitcase was only the beginning. And as his mind raced through the possibilities, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a small part of a much larger problem. As his supervisor looked at him, a sense of urgency filled the room. "What's next?" the supervisor asked, clearly not grasping the full extent of what was happening. "We need to report this immediately," Rick said, "and we need to figure out who's behind this." The name Reynolds flickered in his mind, a well-known animal rights advocate. But now, Rick's gut was telling him that she wasn't just an advocate. There was something darker hidden beneath the surface. As the backup officers secured the area and called in the authorities, Rick's eyes drifted back to Levi. The dog's unshakable loyalty and vigilance had brought them to this point. But what lay ahead would be far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. As Rick and the backup officers worked to secure the area, his mind raced. The tiger cub and the other animals in the suitcase were just the beginning. He had a feeling, one that had been growing since the moment Levi first reacted to the suitcase, that they had stumbled onto something much bigger than just a routine animal smuggling operation. The case was becoming personal. The name Reynolds kept echoing in his mind, though he couldn't yet explain why. Reynolds was an animal rights advocate, known for her public campaigns to protect endangered species. But in that moment, Rick couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was somehow involved in what he had just uncovered. Was it possible that someone so outspoken about protecting animals could also be involved in trafficking them? Rick was determined to find out. He moved to the nearest desk in the holding area, pulling up information on the suitcase's origin. The tracking system showed an unusual route. The suitcase had started its journey in Bangkok, passed through Dubai, and then continued on to Mexico City before finally arriving in New York. The routing was odd, and the manifest described the contents as textiles and handicrafts, a vague description that didn't match the items found inside. Rick felt his stomach churn as he realized how easy it was for people like Reynolds to hide illegal activities behind legitimate shipments. Rick's thoughts were interrupted when the radio crackled. His supervisor's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Thompson, we need you in the security room. Something's come up about Reynolds." The name made Rick's pulse quicken. He quickly motioned to the other officers. "Stay on this. I'm going to the security room." In the cramped security office, Rick was met by a technician who immediately pulled up footage from the airport's security cameras. The screen displayed Reynolds, speaking to an airport official. She was charming, articulate, all smiles as she walked through the terminal. But Rick couldn't shake the suspicion that behind the smile was a woman who knew how to manipulate the system. "I've seen her before," Rick muttered under his breath. "She's too clean, too perfect." The technician nodded, scrolling through the footage. "She's been here before, several times in fact. And I found something else. There's a record of her having coordinated with a few known wildlife trafficking operations. Nothing concrete, just a few phone calls and emails, but it's enough to raise red flags." Rick's mind raced as he processed this new information. Reynolds was likely involved in something much darker than anyone had realized. He had to dig deeper. And with Levi by his side, Rick felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let this slide, not after everything he had already seen. "Keep me updated," Rick said, his tone serious. "I'm going to keep an eye on that suitcase. I want to know everything about its history." He left the security room and returned to the holding area where Levi was waiting. The dog was unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the suitcase as if he knew something Rick didn't. It was as though Levi could sense that they were on the edge of something big, something dangerous. Rick squatted down beside the suitcase, placing his hand gently on Levi's head. "We're not done yet, buddy," he whispered. "We're going to get to the bottom of this." But as he stood up, Rick felt an unease creep over him. Max, another canine officer, had joined them in the holding area, and the dog's behavior was far from normal. Unlike Levi, who had always been calm under pressure, Max seemed on edge. His ears were flattened and his tail was low, a clear sign of anxiety. "Max, what is it, boy?" Rick asked, looking down at the dog. But Max didn't respond. He just stared at the suitcase, his muscles tense. Rick's unease grew. It was as though Max could feel something dangerous hidden inside, just like Levi had earlier. He turned to one of the backup officers. Keep an eye on this. I'm going to check on Reynolds' background more. Something doesn't add up. As Rick left the holding area to continue his investigation, he couldn't help but feel that he was inching closer to uncovering a much larger web of corruption. He wasn't sure what he would find, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. Rick's mind raced as he walked out of the holding area. Max's unusual behavior only heightened his suspicions, and the thought of what could be inside the suitcase left a tight knot in his stomach. He knew that something didn't add up, and the feeling only intensified as he headed to the airport's security office. His instincts had never steered him wrong before, and right now, they were screaming that he was standing on the edge of uncovering something much darker. He approached the desk where the airport's security records were stored, pulling up the information on the suitcase and its history. The first thing that caught his eye was the flight route. The suitcase had originated in Bangkok, then transferred through Dubai, before landing in Mexico City, and finally arriving at JFK. While international flights passed through the airport daily, the route seemed off. Why would someone go through so many transfer points instead of a direct flight? Rick opened the manifest, but the description of the contents raised more questions. The document stated that the suitcase contained textiles and handicrafts, but after seeing what he had just uncovered, he knew that couldn't be true. He tried cross-referencing the names and addresses listed on the manifest, but the information was inconsistent. Some of the details matched up, but there were glaring discrepancies. Names didn't align with any known cargo companies, and the phone numbers appeared disconnected. Rick's suspicion grew stronger as he scanned the details. Someone had gone to great lengths to obscure the origin of this suitcase. It wasn't just an innocent mistake. This was deliberate. Something's off, Rick muttered under his breath as he made a note of the inconsistencies. But as he dug deeper, he ran into an unexpected roadblock. The higher-ups at the airport didn't seem to share his concern. He was directed to Supervisor Peterson, who was usually easygoing but now appeared distracted and dismissive. "Thompson, we've gone over this. The suitcase didn't trigger any alarms. We've got procedures for this kind of thing. Let's stick to them," Peterson said, waving off Rick's concerns. "But we're not getting the full picture here," Rick replied, his frustration evident. "The manifest is incomplete, the route doesn't make sense, and now we know it's linked to animal trafficking. We can't just let this slide." "Look, I understand your concerns," Peterson said, though his tone was more condescending than supportive. "But this isn't the first time a suitcase with minor discrepancies has been flagged. We can't go overboard unless we have concrete proof." Rick was taken aback by Peterson's dismissal. He had worked under Peterson for over a year, and never had he seen his supervisor this reluctant to investigate further. It wasn't like Peterson to shut down a concern so quickly. Rick couldn't ignore it. Something was definitely being covered up. He stared at Peterson for a moment, his jaw tightening. "I'll keep investigating. If you can't see it, I will," he said quietly. "Suit yourself," Peterson muttered as he turned away. Rick's heart pounded. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Peterson's reluctance to follow up on this case could be part of a larger pattern. Was someone higher up involved in this? Levi's strange behavior and Max's anxiousness only added to his growing suspicion. Max had become increasingly unsettled since they had left the holding area, his gaze fixed on Rick as if trying to communicate the urgency of the situation. The dog's behavior seemed to mirror Rick's own unease, and it was hard to ignore. Rick couldn't shake the feeling that he was being held back by forces beyond his control. "I'm not backing down," Rick muttered, his eyes narrowing with determination. He had already come too far to turn back now. Levi was watching him from the side, sensing his resolve. Rick rubbed the dog's head, grounding himself, before continuing his investigation. He knew the path ahead was going to be difficult, but he couldn't afford to ignore the truth any longer. Someone was trying to hide something big, and Reynolds, with her facade of animal rights activism, was likely at the heart of it. Rick sat at his desk, his fingers tapping restlessly against the keyboard as he pulled up everything he could find on Reynolds. She was a well-known figure in the animal rights community, her face often plastered across media campaigns and rallies advocating for endangered species. She ran a highly regarded animal protection foundation that fought to save animals from illegal poaching and trafficking. To the public, Reynolds was the hero, a warrior for animal rights. But as Rick dove deeper into his research, he started to notice things that didn't add up. On paper, Reynolds' foundation appeared legitimate. It had the necessary permits, the right connections, and even a team of veterinarians working with endangered animals. But as Rick looked further into her background, the cracks began to show. There were discrepancies in her foundation's financials, strange transfers of money between shell companies, and a series of anonymous donations that were linked to known wildlife traffickers. The more Rick dug, the more the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. She wasn't just a philanthropist. Reynolds had cleverly used her foundation as a front to cover her tracks. The donations and grants she received were not always spent on animal conservation. In fact, some of the money had been traced to accounts that linked directly to international trafficking rings. Rick's heart sank as the pieces of this larger operation began to form a disturbing picture. Reynolds was not the protector she claimed to be. She was an integral part of a massive illegal wildlife trafficking syndicate. Rick leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. It made sense now. The unmarked suitcase, the strange route it had taken, and the involvement of Sarah, the logistics coordinator who had been acting suspiciously around the time the suitcase appeared. It was all connected to Reynolds and her network. The suitcase wasn't just carrying endangered species, it was part of a larger, much more sinister operation. He needed more proof, and fast. He couldn't just rely on the circumstantial evidence he had gathered. Reynolds had been careful, meticulous even, hiding her criminal activities behind the noble cause of saving animals. But Rick knew better. There was always a trail, no matter how carefully it was hidden, and he was determined to find it. Rick stood up and paced the room, his mind already moving ahead. There were still many questions left unanswered. How long had Reynolds been operating this network? Who else was involved? And most importantly, what was her end game? He knew he had to move quickly. Reynolds was smart, and the longer it took to expose her, the more dangerous the situation would become. As he looked over the information he had on Reynolds, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was an alert from the airport security team about the suitcase. Rick's pulse quickened as he opened the message. The authorities had finally gotten involved, and they were eager to move forward with the investigation. This was the break he needed. But as Rick read the message, a sinking feeling formed in his chest. The suitcase had disappeared. The records showed that it had been processed as abandoned property and sent to a warehouse for storage. Someone had already tampered with the evidence. The frustration that built up inside Rick was palpable. He was being blocked at every turn. He had no time to waste. If Reynolds was behind the smuggling ring, she was well aware of the growing investigation and would do anything to cover her tracks. He needed to act fast and find a way to track down the missing suitcase, which could hold the key to everything. Rick's frustration mounted as he stared at the message on his phone. The suitcase, the only piece of physical evidence that could tie Reynolds to the smuggling operation, had disappeared without a trace. The authorities were supposed to be handling it, but now the trail was cold. He had a bad feeling, one that gnawed at him as he thought about everything that had happened so far. Reynolds was cunning, and the more Rick dug, the more he realized she wasn't working alone. The network was far larger than he initially thought. But it wasn't just Reynolds who concerned him now. There was someone else, someone closer to him than he had first suspected: Sarah. Rick had always admired her efficiency. She was the airport logistics coordinator, always on top of her game. But lately, something about her behavior had begun to raise flags. Sarah had been around during some of the more unusual events, like when Levi had reacted to the unmarked suitcase or when Rick had first started following the suspicious trail of evidence. She had always seemed to pop up just when things were getting tense, often appearing at the same time Rick was investigating shipments or cargo that didn't quite make sense. It was as though she knew where to be and when to be there. Rick's mind raced as he recalled the moments when he'd seen Sarah near suspicious cargo. Was it coincidence, or was she involved somehow? He didn't want to believe it, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Sarah had the perfect access. She worked in logistics, which meant she had direct knowledge of shipments, schedules, and who handled what. She could easily facilitate the movement of illegal cargo without raising suspicion. Rick's suspicion grew stronger when he learned that Sarah had been on shift the same day the suitcase had gone missing. The timeline wasn't adding up. She had been seen near the storage area where the suitcase had been held just hours before it vanished. And when Rick had checked the security footage from the warehouse, her image wasn't just a fleeting presence, she had been there, walking past the very area where the suitcase had been processed as abandoned property. It was too much of a coincidence. Could Sarah have been the one to tamper with the evidence? The more Rick thought about it, the more he believed that Sarah was playing a role far bigger than he had initially suspected. She wasn't just another employee, she was likely involved with Reynolds in some way. Rick needed answers. He had to find out what Sarah was hiding, and fast. If she was indeed part of this, it meant Reynolds had an insider at the airport, someone who could access crucial information about cargo movements and shipments. The realization hit Rick like a ton of bricks. If he didn't act quickly, Sarah could be the key to bringing everything crashing down, or worse, she could be the one to stop him from ever uncovering the full truth. He knew what he had to do next. It was time to confront Sarah, but he had to be careful. There were too many moving pieces, and one wrong move could tip her off. Rick couldn't afford to make a mistake now. He couldn't let her slip away, especially when he was so close to uncovering the full extent of the operation. The moment had come. Rick's gut told him that the key to breaking this case wide open lay with Reynolds. He had gathered enough evidence to piece together the outline of a criminal network, a network that was operating right under his nose, hidden behind the guise of animal protection. Now it was time to confront her, and Rick knew it wouldn't be easy. He stood outside her office at the airport, watching the tall glass doors that separated him from his target. Reynolds had always been one step ahead of everyone, her polished image of a compassionate animal rights advocate masking something far more sinister. She was a master of controlling the narrative, always managing to stay above suspicion, but not anymore. Rick was determined to crack the facade, and this time he wasn't backing down. Rick took a deep breath, steeling himself. As he walked toward the door, he heard Levi's soft panting behind him, a reminder of the bond between them. Levi had been by his side through thick and thin, and today would be no different. He wasn't alone in this fight. With a firm knock, Rick entered the office. Reynolds looked up from behind her desk, her serene expression immediately shifting into one of cool, controlled professionalism. "Officer Thompson," she said, her voice smooth. "What brings you to my office?" Rick could already feel the tension building. The air seemed to grow thicker, and he didn't miss the way Reynolds' eyes subtly flicked to Levi, who stood by his side, watching her intently. Rick knew she was sizing him up, but he wasn't here for pleasantries. "Ms. Reynolds, we need to talk," Rick said, his tone firm but calm. He took a step forward, locking eyes with her. "I have reason to believe that your organization is involved in illegal wildlife trafficking. The suitcase we found, the one you've been trying to cover up, it's not an isolated incident. It's part of something much larger." For a moment, there was silence. Reynolds' expression didn't change, but Rick could see the faintest twitch of her jaw. She was good, too good. She had clearly anticipated this conversation, but Rick had no intention of backing down. "I'm afraid you've been misinformed, officer," she replied, her voice calm, almost condescending. "My organization has always acted within the bounds of the law. We rescue animals. We protect them. You're mistaken if you think otherwise." Rick took another step forward, this time letting his voice carry the weight of his conviction. "I'm not mistaken. I've seen the evidence. I've followed the trail. You've been using your foundation as a front to move endangered species across borders. The animals we found were just the tip of the iceberg. Your involvement in this is undeniable." Reynolds remained unfazed, her gaze never leaving his. "I understand your passion, officer, but I suggest you be careful with your accusations. They could have serious consequences." Her words were measured, but Rick could feel the underlying threat. She wasn't intimidated, not yet. Rick paused, gathering his thoughts. Reynolds was clever, no doubt about it. She wasn't going to crumble easily, and Rick knew it, but he also knew one thing. She couldn't keep running forever. No matter how much she tried to deflect, the truth was coming for her. "I'm not backing down," Rick said, his voice steady. "This is bigger than you, bigger than your foundation, and I'm not leaving until the truth comes to light." The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Rick could sense that Reynolds was carefully weighing her options. She had the power, the connections, the ability to cover her tracks, but she couldn't keep hiding forever. Not from him, not from Levi, and not from the evidence that was slowly closing in on her. Rick's eyes narrowed, and he took a step back, his gaze never leaving Reynolds. He wasn't going to let her intimidate him. "I'll see you in court," he said, turning on his heel to leave the office. He had already said what needed to be said, and now the ball was in Reynolds' court. She could either keep playing the game or face the consequences. As Rick left the office, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he had taken the first step. He had exposed her for what she truly was, a fraud, a liar, a trafficker in disguise. The truth was out, and now it was time to let it unfold. Rick stood in the hallway outside Reynolds' office, his thoughts swirling. He had just confronted her, and while her calm, calculated demeanor hadn't cracked, Rick knew she was rattled. She had shown no sign of giving up her facade, but that only strengthened Rick's resolve. If she was desperate enough to play the role of the perfect animal rights advocate, it meant she had a lot to lose. And that meant she would stop at nothing to protect her empire. An empire built on lies and human greed. But the more Rick thought about it, the more certain he became that Reynolds' story wouldn't hold up for long. As he returned to his desk, Levi by his side, Rick opened the new data he had just received from the forensics team. A breakthrough was in the works. The latest analysis on the suitcase showed something unexpected: fingerprints. The first round of scans had come back negative, but when the experts revisited the prints on the suitcase and the cages inside, they had found partial prints. They didn't belong to any airport personnel, and what's more, they were traced to a location, a warehouse in Bangkok, a place directly linked to Reynolds' network. Rick's heart raced. He had suspected there was more to Reynolds than met the eye, but this confirmed it. She had ties to known wildlife traffickers. The fingerprints were a clear link, and that warehouse could hold answers to the larger operation she was running. It was time to push harder. As Rick worked through the night, he dug deeper into the connections between Reynolds and the criminal syndicates. He scoured records, cross-referenced dates, and found an unsettling pattern. Reynolds wasn't just involved in trafficking a few endangered species. She was operating on a massive scale. The evidence pointed to an international smuggling route involving tigers, rhinos, and elephants, with shipments passing through airports worldwide. And the most chilling part? Reynolds' foundation had been the perfect cover for the illegal activity. By the time Rick had pieced together the puzzle, a clearer picture emerged. Reynolds had been using the resources and influence of her foundation to fund and manage trafficking operations. Donations meant for conservation had been funneled into shady transactions, money laundering schemes, and bribes paid to corrupt officials. The irony was staggering. The very people who trusted her were funding the suffering of animals. Rick looked down at Levi, who was lying on the floor beside him, sensing his partner's unease. Levi's eyes met his, calm yet alert, as if to say, "We're getting closer." Rick knew the dog was right. They had the evidence now. It wasn't just about proving that Reynolds was involved, it was about stopping her before she could cover her tracks entirely. But as the hours passed and the investigation unfolded, Rick couldn't ignore the increasing sense of urgency. Reynolds was clearly trying to hide her tracks, manipulating the system at every turn. She was powerful, well-connected, and capable of using her influence to erase any traces of wrongdoing. The closer Rick got to the truth, the more dangerous the situation became. It wasn't just about busting a trafficking ring anymore. It was about taking down someone with far-reaching power who would stop at nothing to protect her secrets. Rick's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. The message was from the airport's surveillance team. They had uncovered new footage from the warehouse in Bangkok, and the person in the video, standing beside a stack of illegally trafficked wildlife products, was none other than Reynolds herself. This was it. Rick had the smoking gun. Rick stood frozen in front of his computer screen, staring at the footage from the Bangkok warehouse. The grainy image showed Reynolds standing next to a pile of illegally trafficked wildlife products, her hands moving expertly as she coordinated the shipment of endangered species. The unmistakable look of authority on her face sent a chill down Rick's spine. This wasn't just some rogue operation. Reynolds was orchestrating a global trafficking ring. The realization hit him like a freight train. Reynolds had been running this operation under the guise of her Animal Rights Foundation for years, and now he had the evidence. This was the breakthrough Rick had been waiting for. His phone buzzed again, shaking him out of his daze. It was a message from his team at the airport. Urgent update. Reynolds Associates are preparing to move a shipment of endangered species tonight. We have intel on the location. Rick's heart raced. He knew this was his only chance to catch Reynolds in the act. There would be no second chances. He glanced down at Levi, who had been quietly sitting by his side, his sharp eyes now alert to the tension in the room. They were going in. "We've got one shot at this, Levi," Rick said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Levi responded with a soft woof, his tail flicking in anticipation. They were a team. Nothing would stop them. The message led them to a freight terminal on the outskirts of the airport. It was a large, dimly lit area, a place where shipments often went unnoticed, hidden among countless others. Rick and Levi approached cautiously, their footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. They were on high alert, knowing that Reynolds wouldn't let this go down without a fight. As they crept through the shadows, Rick's mind raced. This was more than just capturing criminals. It was personal now. Reynolds had deceived the world for years, using her influence to protect her dark secrets. She had exploited her foundation's resources, and Rick was done being part of her game. He signaled to Levi and they split up, taking different routes to cover more ground. Rick could feel the intensity of the moment in the air. He wasn't sure what he would face inside, but he was ready. He had come too far to let Reynolds slip away now. Suddenly he heard the sound of voices, low murmurs coming from the direction of a shipping container. Rick's instincts kicked in, and he motioned for Levi to stay quiet. They crouched behind a stack of crates, peeking around the corner. In front of them, Reynolds' men were moving crates into a waiting truck. Among the cargo, Rick could make out the faint outline of animal cages. This was it. The shipment that could bring everything crashing down. Rick's heart pounded in his chest as he moved silently toward the truck. He had to act quickly. As Rick advanced, one of Reynolds' associates glanced up, spotting him just as he stepped out of the shadows. "He's here!" the man shouted, reaching for a weapon. In an instant, chaos erupted. The man lunged toward Rick, but Levi was faster. With a low growl, Levi surged forward, knocking the man off balance. The two struggled on the ground, but Levi's training gave him the edge. Within seconds, the man was disarmed, and Levi stood over him, growling. Rick drew his weapon, but his attention was divided between the fight and the truck. He couldn't let the shipment get away. He took off toward the vehicle, just as Reynolds herself appeared, standing at the back of the truck with a smug look on her face. "You're too late!" she called out, her voice laced with arrogance. "This is already over!" Rick's blood boiled. He wasn't about to let her win. "Not today," he shot back, moving closer, his eyes locked on hers. Before he could take another step, Reynolds motioned to her men, and the truck started to roll. It was clear now. She wasn't going down without a fight. Rick's pulse quickened as he made a split-second decision. He couldn't let the shipment leave the terminal. With a deep breath, he aimed his gun at the truck's tire and fired. The loud explosion of the shot rang out through the terminal. The truck swerved violently to the side, coming to a screeching halt. The fight wasn't over yet, but Rick had bought them precious time. The screech of the truck's tires reverberated through the terminal, and Rick rushed forward, his gun still in hand. He didn't hesitate. The chaos in the air was palpable, but his focus remained locked on Reynolds. Her smirk faltered as the truck came to a halt. The smug confidence she had carried so easily moments ago began to crack. "Stop right there, Reynolds," Rick commanded, his voice sharp and unwavering. Reynolds raised an eyebrow as if she had expected this, but the defiance was still there in her eyes. "You think you've won?" she spat, stepping back toward the truck, as if still willing to make a run for it. Levi stood by Rick's side, eyes trained on the woman, growling low, his instincts warning him of the danger ahead. Rick's heart raced, but he kept his composure. Reynolds wasn't backing down, and he knew it would take more than just a standoff to take her down. He signaled for Levi to stay close, and with one last glance at Reynolds, Rick moved swiftly to the back of the truck. He wasn't going to give her a chance to slip away. He threw open the door, revealing the cramped interior filled with crates stacked high. The animals, the very ones he had been chasing for so long, were packed tightly inside. Tigers, rare birds, and other endangered species, all barely breathing, some motionless. His stomach twisted at the sight of the suffering, his fury mounting. Reynolds was no longer in control of the situation. She'd played her hand, and now Rick had all the evidence he needed to put her and her network behind bars. Rick turned back to Reynolds, who was now glaring at him. Her earlier composure shattered. "You're finished. We've got everything we need to bring you down. The authorities will be here soon, and it's over." But Reynolds didn't flinch. Instead, she gave him a cold smile. "You think you're the first to try? You're just a small part of something much bigger than you realize. This isn't over, Thompson. Not by a long shot." Rick was about to respond when a sudden movement caught his eye. He spun around only to see Sarah standing in the doorway of the terminal, her face pale, her expression unreadable. Rick's blood ran cold. He had been so focused on Reynolds that he hadn't seen the true betrayal coming. Sarah, the one person he had trusted throughout this entire investigation, was standing there, and it wasn't just a coincidence. "Sarah," Rick said, his voice tight with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Her face hardened as she stepped forward, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't want this, Rick. You have no idea what I've been forced into." The betrayal hit Rick like a physical blow. He felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him, his trust in Sarah shattered in an instant. She had been with him through every step of this investigation, feeding him information, assisting in every lead. How had he missed it? "I was just following orders," she said, her voice shaking, though her eyes avoided his. "I never wanted to hurt anyone, but I'm too deep in this now. They've got too much on me. Reynolds has more power than you think." Rick's head spun. The walls were closing in. He had never expected Sarah, someone he thought was his ally, to be working for Reynolds all along. The pieces were falling into place now. Sarah had been feeding information to Reynolds, sabotaging the investigation at every turn. The realization hit hard. Sarah had been the mole, the insider, the one keeping Reynolds one step ahead. Rick's mind raced and his heart pounded in his chest. Levi sensed his agitation standing close by, watching Sarah with a wary eye. Rick took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let this slip away, not now. "You were working with Reynolds the entire time," Rick said, his voice cold with anger and betrayal. "Everything was a lie. All the information you gave me, it was all a setup." Sarah's eyes filled with guilt, but there was no turning back now. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. "They have my family. If I didn't cooperate, they would—" Rick didn't want to hear it. Sarah's explanation didn't matter anymore. He had trusted her, and she had betrayed that trust in the worst way possible. "We'll deal with this later," Rick said, cutting her off, his voice sharp. He turned back to Reynolds, who was watching the exchange with a cold, calculating look on her face. "You're going to pay for everything you've done, and so is everyone who helped you." Rick felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The truth was out now, but there was still more to be done. Reynolds and her network were still dangerous, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He needed to finish this. The air in the freight terminal was thick with tension. After the shocking betrayal by Sarah, Rick knew that the stakes had just been raised. Reynolds wasn't going to let this slip away. She had too much to lose, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The truth was out, but Rick still had to get the remaining tiger cubs to safety. They couldn't let Reynolds' operation continue. They couldn't let her win. The cubs, though weak and malnourished, had survived the horrors they'd endured so far. Dr. Parker had done everything she could to stabilize them, and now They were finally going to be moved to a wildlife sanctuary in Florida for proper care. But Rick knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Levi stood at his side, his stance alert as ever, as if sensing the danger that was closing in. Rick paced the holding area, running through the details of the transfer in his mind. They had arranged for a small, inconspicuous convoy to move the cubs. Dr. Parker would accompany the cubs to the sanctuary, and Rick and Levi would provide security. The plan was simple: get the cubs to safety without drawing attention to the operation. But deep down, Rick could feel the unease crawling up his spine. Reynolds wasn't going to let them make it out without a fight. She would do whatever it took to stop them from bringing her down, and with the connection she had, Rick knew that nothing was off limits. As the convoy prepared to leave, Rick's instincts kicked in. He stood outside, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The night was eerily quiet, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Levi stood at his side, his ears perked, as if the dog sensed something was amiss. "Stay close," Rick whispered to Levi, his voice tense. He wasn't sure if it was just the lingering threat from Reynolds or the uneasy feeling that came with knowing they were moving into enemy territory. But he trusted Levi, and that trust kept him grounded. The convoy began to move, winding its way through the back roads leading out of the airport. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive, but Rick wasn't about to take any chances. He stayed in the rear, keeping an eye on the road behind them, while Levi sat on alert next to him, scanning their surroundings. Suddenly, there was a flash of headlights in the distance. Rick's heart skipped a beat. He turned to Levi. "Get ready." Before he could react, the vehicle behind them sped up, cutting off the convoy. A group of masked men in tactical gear poured out, blocking the road ahead. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, and Rick's heart dropped. Reynolds had made her move. The truck swerved, coming to a sudden stop as a group of armed men surrounded it. Rick's pulse quickened, and he gripped his weapon tightly. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This was an ambush. The men were here for one thing, the cubs, and they would do whatever it took to stop them from reaching safety. Without a second thought, Rick and Levi sprang into action. Levi darted forward, barking loudly as he charged toward the nearest attacker. Rick followed suit, drawing his weapon as he scanned the chaos unfolding around him. "Stay with me, Levi," Rick shouted as he sprinted toward the truck. The attackers were well trained, and they fought viciously to keep the convoy from moving. Levi's growls filled the air as he pinned one of the assailants to the ground, giving Rick a brief window to break through their defenses, but this was just the beginning. The ambush was part of something bigger, a desperate last-ditch effort by Reynolds to protect her criminal operation. Rick could see the fear in the eyes of the cubs as they huddled inside the truck, and it only fueled his determination. He wasn't going to let them fall into the hands of Reynolds' men. The gunfire grew louder as the battle intensified. Every step was a risk, every second a choice between survival and the mission at hand. But there was no turning back now. Rick had to get the cubs to safety. He couldn't let Reynolds win. Not this time. The air was thick with gunfire, the sharp crack of bullets splitting the night. Levi was a blur of motion, taking down one of the attackers with precision, his teeth sinking into the man's arm before the man could react. But this was far from over. Reynolds' men were relentless, closing in from all directions, their guns trained on Rick and the convoy. The truck carrying the cubs was still surrounded, and the situation was escalating fast. Rick could hear Levi's growls, see the viciousness in his dog's eyes as he took down another assailant, but Rick knew he couldn't keep relying on Levi alone. The cubs were in immediate danger, and Reynolds wasn't far off. He needed to act, and fast. "Levi, stay with the cubs," Rick shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. He knew there was no time to waste. The decision he was about to make would determine the fate of everything, the cubs, Levi, and the future of the investigation. Rick's eyes darted between the men closing in on him and the truck. Reynolds was somewhere in the chaos, orchestrating the ambush from behind the front lines. She had to be stopped, but so did the threat to the cubs. As Rick sprinted toward the truck, gunfire grazed the edge of his vest. The pain was instant, but it was nothing compared to the pain he would feel if he failed to protect these innocent lives. Levi was already back at the truck, barking ferociously at anyone who came near the rear door, but it was clear the cubs weren't safe yet. In a split second, Rick made his decision. He couldn't risk the cubs being caught in the crossfire. He reached for his radio, his voice calm but tense. "Get the cubs to the safe house, now!" The orders were clear. He trusted his team to follow through, but Rick knew the clock was ticking. Every second mattered. Yet, as he turned to head toward the front of the truck, he saw Reynolds emerging from the shadows. The moment of confrontation had arrived. Rick's heart raced. Reynolds had a gun trained on him, her face contorted with a mixture of defiance and anger. She wasn't going to back down. She was too far gone in her criminal empire to walk away now. Her voice cut through the chaos like a razor. "You think you've won, Thompson?" she sneered, her finger hovering over the trigger. "You're just a pawn in a game much bigger than you." Rick's mind raced. Was it worth it to confront Reynolds now? She had the power, the resources, but could he really let her slip away? The cubs were still in danger, and Levi was doing everything he could to protect them, but Rick couldn't afford to waste any more time. His heart was torn in two, his duty to the cubs and his thirst for justice for Emily, the daughter he had lost so many years ago. Reynolds was responsible for countless lives destroyed by her greed, and Rick knew that he couldn't let her escape. The decision had to be made now, and it was the hardest choice Rick had ever faced. In a flash, he sprinted toward Reynolds, aiming to disarm her. He couldn't let her get away. He couldn't let her continue her reign of terror over innocent lives. But as he lunged forward, a shot rang out. The sound was deafening. Rick's world spun, his body thrown backward by the force of the impact. He hit the ground hard, his vision blurring for a split second. Pain shot through his side, but Rick pushed through it. He could hear Levi barking in the distance, and in the chaos he realized something. He couldn't let Reynolds get away, not now. He had to make the choice. The cubs or Reynolds. Levi was there to protect the cubs. Rick couldn't let Reynolds escape. With his gun drawn and his heart pounding, Rick surged forward, determined to finish this once and for all. The shot rang out, and Rick's body jerked violently. The world spun as pain radiated from his side, a sharp, burning reminder of just how close he had come to losing everything. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat, and his body hit the ground hard. But there was no time to rest. He pushed through the pain, forcing himself to focus. He could hear Levi's barks in the distance, his loyal companion still fighting to keep the cubs safe. But it was the next sound that hit Rick like a ton of bricks, the faint whimper of a cub. A weak, breathless sound, one Rick knew all too well. The cubs, Justice in particular, had been through hell already. But this was different. This wasn't just an injury, it was the end. Rick's eyes darted to the truck where the cubs were being kept. Levi was standing protectively over Justice, who lay still, her tiny chest barely rising. The other cubs were nestled close by, looking up at the situation with wide, fearful eyes. But it was Justice's body that made Rick's heart break. He staggered to his feet, clutching his side where the bullet had torn through his vest. The pain was sharp, but it paled in comparison to the loss he now felt. Justice, the smallest, the one who had fought so hard to survive, wasn't going to make it. He had endured unimaginable suffering during the long journey from the trafficker's hands, but it was now clear that the toll had been too much. Rick's legs felt weak as he reached the cub, kneeling beside Levi, who looked up at him with pleading eyes. The dog, ever the protector, didn't move away, but his posture was one of surrender. Rick placed a hand gently on Justice's tiny head, feeling the warmth leave her body as he tried to steady his emotions. Justice had fought. She had fought so hard to survive, and now, despite everything, she was slipping away. A lump formed in Rick's throat as he gently cradled the cub in his arms. He could feel the life draining from her, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The reality hit him hard. This wasn't just about the animals or Reynolds anymore. This was personal. He had failed to protect one of the very creatures he had sworn to save. Rick's anger bubbled to the surface, raw and unrelenting. He clenched his jaw, his fists tightening as he looked toward Reynolds, who stood by watching the situation unfold with cold indifference. The rage inside him burned hot. How many more innocent lives would Reynolds sacrifice to fuel her empire of cruelty? "Reynolds," Rick gritted through his teeth, "this is your fault." His voice was hoarse with emotion as he spoke, but the pain from the bullet and the loss of justice turned his words into a force of pure fury. But he didn't have time to dwell on his anger. He had made a promise to justice, and now it was time to keep it. He couldn't let this tragedy be in vain. He couldn't let Reynolds get away with it. The fight had to continue, not just for the Cubs, but for every victim of Reynolds' empire. The rest of the team had heard the gunshot, and they were closing in. Rick could hear the sound of sirens growing louder in the distance. Levi barked again, this time with a triumphant edge, as if to say, "We're not finished yet." Rick's thoughts were a blur of pain, anger, and determination. Justice was gone, but the fight wasn't over. He had to make sure Reynolds paid for her crimes, and he would stop at nothing to bring her to justice. The Cubs, what was left of them, needed protection, and Levi was still on their side. The fight would go on, and it would be for justice. With one last look at the cub, Rick set her down gently, his hand lingering for a moment on her tiny form. "I'm sorry, little one," he whispered. "We'll make sure your sacrifice counts." Rick stood over the lifeless body of Justice, his heart heavy with grief and anger. But there was no time to mourn, no time to reflect on the loss of the innocent cub. The sirens were getting closer and the authorities were arriving. It was now or never. He had made a promise to justice, and the fight had to continue for the Cubs, for Levi, and for everyone else who had suffered because of Reynolds and her criminal empire. He turned back toward the team, who were rushing to secure the area. The fight had escalated into something bigger than he had ever anticipated, but Rick knew one thing: it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The evidence was within his reach, and he was determined to see Reynolds and her operation brought to justice. With a sense of urgency, Rick spoke to his team, rallying them together. "We need everything we can get. The Cubs are a start, but we need the rest. I know Reynolds is connected to something much bigger, and we can't afford to let her slip away." They quickly moved into action. One officer began searching the immediate area for any additional evidence, while another began contacting the authorities to secure Reynolds' property and any related assets. Levi was still at Rick's side, ever the vigilant protector, though the dog's energy seemed to mirror Rick's, exhausted but unwavering. Rick, meanwhile, focused on gathering the evidence from the truck and the surrounding area. The crates containing the remaining Cubs had been carefully inspected, and the truth was undeniable. There were files documenting transactions, lists of smugglers' names, and codes that linked directly to international trafficking networks. There were photographs, too. Pictures of Reynolds herself, meeting with known criminals in Bangkok and Dubai, coordinating deals in dark corners of the world. Rick's heart pounded as he pulled the evidence together. Each new piece of information only reinforced what he already knew. Reynolds had been running a sophisticated operation for years, using her foundation as a cover for one of the most extensive wildlife trafficking rings in the world. He could hardly believe the scope of it. This wasn't just about animals. This was about power, money, and manipulation on an international scale. As the team worked quickly, collecting the scattered files and photographs, Rick's thoughts turned back to Levi. The dog had been by his side through everything, from the initial discovery of the suitcase to the moment they had nearly lost the Cubs. Rick knew that Levi had played a crucial role in this, his instincts guiding them every step of the way. Rick couldn't have done it without him. "We've got everything we need," one of the officers said as they brought a stack of documents over to Rick. "It's all here, proof of the trafficking routes, the money trail, everything." Rick took the papers, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This was the moment he had been working toward. He had the evidence. They had the proof. But there was still one more thing that had to be done: bringing Reynolds down. Rick glanced around the scene, his thoughts running ahead. Reynolds would never go down quietly. She was too powerful, too connected. But now, Rick had everything he needed to make sure the truth came to light. There was no going back. He couldn't stop until she paid for her crimes. The investigation wasn't just about exposing her, it was about ending the network of wildlife trafficking that had caused so much suffering. "We move on Reynolds now," Rick said, his voice firm. "We can't waste any more time." As his team nodded and began making the necessary calls to law enforcement, Rick took a final look at the scene. The fight wasn't over, but with the evidence in hand, they were closer than ever to ending Reynolds's empire. Rick's pulse was steady, but his thoughts were racing as he watched his team mobilize. The evidence was in their hands, and they had no time to waste. Reynolds's empire was vast, and her ability to manipulate, bribe, and cover up her crimes had made her untouchable for years. But not anymore. The moment of reckoning had come, and Rick wasn't about to let her slip through his fingers. He turned to his team, his gaze hard. "We move on her now, and we do it right. We can't afford any mistakes." The officers nodded, their faces a mix of determination and urgency. They had all been a part of this investigation for months, and they knew how much was riding on this moment. This wasn't just about busting a criminal network. It was about stopping the suffering of innocent animals, bringing justice to the countless lives that had been destroyed in Reynolds's wake. Rick's mind flashed back to the cubs, especially Justice, the one he couldn't save. That moment would stay with him forever. But it wasn't just the cubs. This fight was bigger than them. It was about exposing a corrupt system that had allowed Reynolds to thrive in the shadows for far too long. As the team gathered their gear and prepared for the operation, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Reynolds was cunning, and she knew how to play the game. If there was one thing Rick had learned through this entire ordeal, it was that she wouldn't go down quietly. She would fight back, and she would use every resource at her disposal to escape the consequences of her actions. Rick took a deep breath. He wasn't afraid of her. He had seen the depths of human cruelty before, and he wasn't about to let her continue exploiting innocent creatures for profit. He glanced at Levi, who was sitting by his side, the dog's eyes sharp and focused, ready for whatever was coming next. "Levi, stay with me," Rick said softly. The dog responded with a low growl, the sound almost like a promise. The team made their way to Reynolds's estate, a sprawling property tucked away from the public eye. Rick knew this was where it would all come to a head. Reynolds had hidden herself behind the veil of charity and conservation, but now they had her. The truth would finally come to light. As they approached the gates of Reynolds's property, the tension in the air was palpable. Rick could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just another raid. This was their last chance to stop Reynolds, to dismantle her criminal operation once and for all. The officers surrounding him were ready, but Rick's eyes were locked on the front door. If Reynolds had anything left to hide, this would be the place to do it. They had to move fast. No room for hesitation. Rick signaled the team, and they moved forward as one. Just as they reached the front door, a shout rang out from inside. "You're too late!" The voice was unmistakable. It was Reynolds. She was waiting for them. Rick's heart raced, and the weight of the moment intensified. "Get ready," Rick whispered to Levi. The dog's muscles tensed in anticipation, ready for whatever came next. With one last glance at his team, Rick kicked the door open, and they stormed in. The final battle had begun. Rick kicked the door open, the force sending it crashing against the wall with a loud bang. The room was dimly lit, but Rick's eyes quickly adjusted. He scanned the room, his heart hammering in his chest. Levi stood at his side, alert, eyes trained on the figures in the shadows. They were ready for anything. But the last thing Rick expected was to see Reynolds standing there, completely calm and unfazed by the chaos unfolding outside. "You think this is the end?" Reynolds' voice was cold, tinged with a hint of amusement. "You think you've won?" Rick's stomach tightened. He had her cornered, but the smug look on her face made him feel like he had just stepped into a trap. There was something about her demeanor that felt too rehearsed, too perfect. This wasn't just a criminal mastermind. They were dealing with someone who had been playing the long game for years, and Rick had just walked right into her web. "Where's the rest of your operation, Reynolds?" Rick demanded, his voice steady but laced with anger. "You can't keep running forever." Reynolds smiled, but it wasn't a smile of defeat. It was one of knowing superiority. "I don't need to run," she replied, "because I have friends who make sure I don't get caught." That was when it hit Rick, the shock that made everything click. Reynolds wasn't just some rogue operator trying to make a quick buck. She had connections, powerful ones. The realization sent a chill down Rick's spine. Reynolds wasn't just a criminal mastermind in the world of wildlife trafficking. She was a part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. Rick's mind raced. Reynolds had connections in the highest places, people in government and even animal protection organizations who were helping her cover her tracks. This wasn't just about animals. This was about an entire network of corruption, one that spanned across borders, facilitated by people in positions of power. Rick's eyes narrowed as he looked at Reynolds. "You've been using your foundation as a front for your trafficking network," he said, the pieces finally coming together. "You've been using the money, the influence, and the media attention to hide your criminal empire." Her smile didn't falter. "You're clever, Officer Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you're naive if you think you can stop this. I've been doing this for years. The people I work with, they don't just vanish. They'll protect me. You've played right into their hands." Rick felt the weight of her words. He had uncovered her crimes, but it seemed like a losing battle. Reynolds wasn't just a criminal. She was part of a well-oiled machine, and it was going to take more than just a few officers and a K-9 team to bring it down. She had people into places where Rick could never reach. He glanced at Levi, who was still at his side, eyes fixed on Reynolds, waiting for the order to move. Levi had been with him through thick and thin, and Rick wasn't about to let this defeat him. He had already lost so much, the cubs, justice, and he couldn't lose now, not when they were this close. "We'll bring you down," Rick said, his voice resolute. "No matter how many people you have behind you, no matter how many connections you think you have. This ends tonight." But Reynolds didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, almost as if she were studying him. "You don't understand, Rick. It's already over. The wheels are in motion, and nothing you do will change that." The weight of her words sunk into Rick's chest. He was running out of time, and the battle was far from over, but he wasn't about to back down. He had come too far. He would expose Reynolds no matter the cost. Rick's mind raced, but his resolve never wavered. Reynolds was right. Time was running out. Her words echoed in his head, and for a moment it felt as though everything had already been set in motion, that their efforts were futile. But then he glanced down at Levi, standing firm by his side, ready to protect the cubs at all costs. He couldn't let Reynolds win, not now, not when they were so close to ending her reign. Rick turned, focusing on the task ahead. He had one goal now: to get the remaining cubs to safety. The operation was already underway. He had contacted the wildlife sanctuary in Florida, where they had arranged for the cubs to receive the care they needed. It was time to move them. Levi had been by Rick's side since the beginning, and the bond they shared was undeniable. The dog had been instrumental in uncovering Reynolds' operation, and now, as the final leg of the mission loomed, Rick felt the weight of the responsibility pressing on him. The cubs were depending on him, and the fight for their future wasn't over yet. The convoy was ready, and Rick had made arrangements for the cubs to be transferred safely, but Reynolds and her men would stop at nothing to reclaim them. The knowledge that they were being hunted, that Reynolds would do anything to prevent their rescue, fueled Rick's every step. The cubs' survival depended on getting them out of Reynolds' reach. Rick and Levi led the convoy toward the transport vehicle, their hearts heavy with the urgency of the situation. They couldn't afford to waste time, and yet, with each passing minute, the risk grew higher. Levi stayed close, his body tense as if sensing the impending danger. Rick's hand rested on the dog's back, grounding himself in the bond they shared. As they neared the exit of the facility, Rick's phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the officers involved in the operation. "We've spotted Reynolds' men. They're closing in. Get the Cubs out of there now." Rick's pulse quickened. The threat was real. He motioned for the convoy to pick up the pace, and as the vehicles moved faster, Rick's focus sharpened. He was too close to failure to let it slip away now. The sound of tires screeching on the asphalt filled the air, and Rick's senses heightened, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Suddenly, Levi growled low, and Rick's body stiffened. He knew something was wrong. Reynolds' men had found them. Without warning, a truck appeared in the rearview mirror, tailing them at high speed. Levi leaped into action, barking and pulling toward the back of the convoy. Rick's heart hammered in his chest as he reached for his weapon, ready for whatever came next. "Levi, stay close!" Rick shouted, his voice tight with urgency. Levi responded immediately, charging ahead toward the truck. The truck veered dangerously close, but before it could collide with the convoy, Rick aimed and fired a warning shot, forcing the vehicle to veer off course. The driver swerved, trying to regain control, but it was clear. This wasn't going to be easy. Rick made a split-second decision. They had to move faster. There was no time to waste, and Levi was already in pursuit of the truck, keeping the attackers at bay. The convoy sped forward, but the danger was far from over. Rick glanced back at the Cubs in the transport vehicle. They were safe. For now. But the danger still loomed large. The closer they got to the sanctuary, the higher the stakes became. He couldn't let Reynolds and her men destroy everything they had fought for. They had come too far to fail. The convoy pushed forward, tires screeching against the asphalt as the transport vehicle carrying the Cubs raced toward safety. The truck they had narrowly evaded had disappeared into the night, but Rick knew that this was only a brief reprieve. Reynolds wasn't going to stop. She had too much at stake, but Rick couldn't afford to let that thought paralyze him. They had the Cubs, they had the evidence, and Reynolds was out of options. The radio crackled in Rick's ear as he checked the rearview mirror, scanning the darkened road for any signs of pursuit. "All units in position. We're closing in on Reynolds' compound. It's time to end this." Rick's grip tightened on the wheel. He couldn't allow Reynolds to slip through his fingers now. They had pushed so hard, made so many sacrifices to get to this point. Levi was still in the back of the convoy, keeping watch over the Cubs. The dog's instincts had been invaluable, and now, as the convoy neared its final destination, the sanctuary, Rick felt a sense of urgency like never before. If they didn't act now, Reynolds would find a way to disappear. She always had. As the convoy neared the sanctuary's secure location, a sharp, intense burst of gunfire broke through the quiet night. Rick's body tensed as he slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a stop. The sound of Reynolds' men closing in on them echoed in the distance, and Rick knew the final showdown was about to unfold. "We need to hold them off, now!" Rick barked as he unbuckled his seatbelt. Levi growled from the back seat, and Rick's eyes darted toward the Cubs. "You stay with the Cubs. I'll handle this." Rick moved swiftly, his pulse racing as he made his way to the front of the convoy, where the first wave of Reynolds' men had begun to fire. Levi was already ahead of him, charging at the attackers with a fierce determination, but Rick had no time to waste. The fight was coming to a head, and it was now or never. Minutes later, law enforcement reinforcements arrived at the scene. The coordinated strike from Rick's team and the law enforcement agents took down the remaining attackers, leaving Reynolds isolated and vulnerable. It was over. Rick's heart was still pounding in his chest as he approached Reynolds. The woman who had once been the face of animal rights was now exposed for the criminal mastermind she truly was. Her foundation, which had once received millions in donations, had been a front for a worldwide trafficking network. The same people she had convinced the world were saving animals had been the ones exploiting them for profit. "You've played your last game, Reynolds," Rick said, his voice cold with resolve. The satisfaction of knowing the operation was finally over did little to ease the pain of Justice's loss, but it was a step in the right direction. Reynolds stood there, her face twisted with defiance, but her eyes betrayed her. She knew the end had come. The truth was out, and she had nowhere left to run. Do you think this will stop me? She spat, her voice laced with venom. You're just a small cog in a much larger machine. You don't even know who you're messing with. Rick stepped closer, his resolve unwavering. It's over, Reynolds. Your network is done. The truth is out, and you're going to pay for the lives you've ruined. The trafficking ends here. Behind him, law enforcement agents moved in, securing Reynolds and her associates. The operation was officially dismantled, and the evidence was irrefutable. She had no more cards to play. As Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, Rick took a moment to breathe. The weight of everything they had just accomplished began to settle in, but there was still work to be done. The Cubs, Liberty, Hope, and the others needed to be cared for. The investigation was far from over, but Reynolds would face justice for her crimes. Rick's eyes flickered to the sanctuary's gates in the distance, knowing that the future of the rescued animals was now in safe hands. They had won the battle, but the fight for the innocent was far from finished. The weight of the moment settled heavily on Rick's chest as he stood silently by the gates of the sanctuary. Reynolds was gone, her criminal empire dismantled, but the echoes of everything they had endured still reverberated in his mind. Levi stood by his side, his eyes calm but filled with the same sense of resolve that Rick had. They had done what they set out to do. They had saved the Cubs, they had exposed the truth, and they had ensured that Reynolds would pay for her crimes. But as Rick watched the peaceful sanctuary in front of him, a deep, aching emptiness gnawed at him. The victory felt hollow, especially with justice still fresh in his mind. That small, fragile cub who had fought so hard to survive, only to be lost in the end. The reality of that loss was something Rick would carry with him forever. It wasn't just about exposing Reynolds, it was about justice. As the truck carrying Liberty and Hope arrived at the sanctuary, Rick's thoughts shifted. These Cubs had made it, thanks to the sacrifice of justice. They were alive. They had a future. And for that, Rick was grateful. But Justice's story wasn't over. It couldn't be. Justice had become a symbol, one that would live on long after her tiny body had been laid to rest. The sanctuary staff moved the Cubs into their new enclosures, their wide eyes scanning the space around them. Rick watched as they hesitated at first, but then slowly explored their new home, their natural instincts guiding them. They were free now, safe. But for Rick, the memories of justice were a stark reminder of how fragile life could be, especially for those who were voiceless, those who relied on others to fight for them. Justice's short life had represented the innocence that had been stolen from so many animals. It was a reminder that, while they had won this battle, the war was still ongoing. Rick stood in the quiet, surrounded by the sound of nature as the sun began to set. The peace was almost surreal. He could feel the weight of all that had happened, the danger, the violence, the heartbreak, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of hope. The Cubs were safe. Levi was with him. And for the first time in a long while, Rick allowed himself to think about something other than the fight. He allowed himself to feel something close to peace. "We did it, boy," Rick said softly to Levi, who looked up at him, his eyes understanding. "We saved them." The sound of footsteps approached, and Rick turned to find Dr. Parker walking toward him. She had been there through it all, helping with the Cubs' recovery and providing the medical expertise they needed. There was no one Rick trusted more in this fight. "I think Justice would be proud," Dr. Parker said, her voice gentle. She had been the one to first care for the Cubs, and she understood the loss just as deeply as Rick. Rick nodded, the lump in his throat growing. She didn't make it, but she saved them. All of them. Liberty, Hope, and every other animal we can protect from now on. It's because of her. There was silence between them, the weight of the truth lingering in the air. Justice had been a victim of a cruel, broken system, but her story had ignited a fire in Rick that couldn't be extinguished. She had given her life for a cause much bigger than herself. "It's not over," Rick said finally, looking out over the sanctuary. "This is just the beginning. We still have work to do." Dr. Parker nodded, her expression firm. I know, and I'll be here to help. Come swing. As the last light of the day faded into the horizon, Rick felt the promise of the future. A future where no more animals would suffer like Justice had. They had started a revolution in the fight for justice, and it was far from over. The sanctuary was a place of hope, but Justice's story would be remembered. Her sacrifice would be the beacon guiding them forward. Every animal saved a testament to her courage and strength. The sun had long set, casting a peaceful glow over the sanctuary. The sounds of nature, birds calling and the rustling of leaves, filled the air. It was hard to believe that just days ago the place had been filled with tension, fear, and uncertainty. Now, the cubs, Liberty and Hope, had finally found their place in the world, a place where they could grow and thrive in safety. But for Rick, the victory felt incomplete. The journey was far from over. As he walked alongside Dr. Parker through the quiet grounds, he couldn't shake the memory of Justice. The tiny cub, so fragile and innocent, had been taken from them far too soon. It was a brutal reminder of just how fragile life could be for the creatures they were trying to save. And yet Justice's death wasn't in vain. It had sparked something deep inside Rick, something that would drive him forward in this battle against cruelty and corruption. I keep thinking about Justice, Rick said softly, breaking the silence as they walked toward the observation area. She was so small, so vulnerable, and yet she fought so hard. It feels wrong that she didn't get to see this day. Dr. Parker walked beside him, her expression calm but filled with understanding. Justice was a fighter, and her fight was never in vain. Her story, her sacrifice, is what's going to keep this fight alive. You won't forget her, Rick. None of us will. Rick nodded, but the weight of Justice's loss still hung heavy in his chest. He had promised himself that he would keep fighting, that her death would not be the end, but it was hard to shake the sadness that lingered. Every animal that was saved from Reynolds's grasp was a victory, yes, but Justice was the one who had paid the ultimate price. You're right, Rick finally said, his voice stronger now. Her story isn't over, and neither is this fight. There are still so many animals out there who need us. They reached the edge of the sanctuary, where the stars twinkled above, and the air had cooled, bringing with it a sense of quiet resolve. Levi was at Rick's side, lying on the grass and watching the peaceful scene before them. The dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that Rick wasn't alone in this. He had a team, he had Levi, and he had the support of people like Dr. Parker, who had become an unwavering ally in this fight. The world isn't perfect, Rick continued, his eyes fixed on the stars. But if we don't keep pushing for change, nothing will ever get better. We can't stop, not now. Dr. Parker smiled gently. And we won't. Not as long as we have the strength to keep going. We're fighting for those who can't fight for themselves, and that's a cause worth dedicating our lives to. Rick took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. Justice's sacrifice had fueled something inside him, a fire that would burn until every last trace of Reynolds' operation was erased, and the innocent animals she had exploited were finally free. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The battle for justice wasn't over. It was a lifelong fight, one that would require persistence, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the cause. But Rick had learned something invaluable over the course of this journey. Justice had taught him that even in the darkest moments there was always hope. That hope lived in the faces of the animals they saved, in the resilience of those like Levi, and in the unwavering dedication of people who refused to look away from suffering. Let's get back to work, Rick said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. We still have a long way to go. In the journey of justice, there is one thing that stands above all: the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. The story of Levi, the German Shepherd, and the cubs, especially Justice, reminds us of the strength found in loyalty, sacrifice, and love. Levi, through his courage and unwavering dedication, showed that True heroes come in many forms, not just in humans, but in animals as well. His instinctive protection of the cubs, his fight alongside Rick, and his loyalty in the face of danger reflect the deep connection we share with animals, a bond built on trust, respect, and mutual care. This story isn't just about bringing criminals to justice. It's about acknowledging the innocent lives affected by human greed and cruelty. Justice's sacrifice wasn't just the end of a life. It became a symbol of what we must protect. Animals are not mere commodities. They are living beings with their own worth, their own right to live without fear. As we look to the future, we must remember that the fight for animals is far from over. There are still many creatures out there who need our help, who rely on us to stand up for them, just as Levi stood by Rick's side. The story of justice and Levi teaches us that we must never stop fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves, that compassion, dedication, and justice are values that transcend all barriers. Let this story be a call to action to love, protect, and cherish the animals we share this world with. And just like Levi and Rick, may we all find the strength to fight for what is right, no matter how tough the battle may be.